Does this work now?
Oh, no, sort of.
It's good now.
Oh, but now we've got a.
Now we've got an echo.
Yeah, but that just means that on the laptop you need to turn
Oh,
the
that's,
sound off.
sorry, that's me.
Okay.
Okay.
Is that all right, Julian?
It's good. I'm guessing he said.
Okay. Now?
Well, I think the issue is also like we are not connected to audio.
Yeah, that's good.
Oh,
Yes.
now it's good. Okay.
That's good, but we can't hear them.
Oh,
If anyone's got any questions, you're here.
Look, if they need to say something, they can type it and something.
Yeah, that's true. Like
Use
we'll
chat.
popping out. Yeah.
Hybrid talks are absolutely.
Yes. Indeed.
But.
A modern necessity.
Yes.
I don't think they can hear me, I've already,
okay.
Mike, can you just speak loudly?
Speak loudly.
Speak quickly.
Yeah, I'll just stand close to
Yeah,
Tony.
he doesn't want to stand, but I don't want to breathe on him though. All right. Thank you, everybody. We're very pleased to have David Gleich here with us this week and a little bit of next week. He's visiting very unexpectedly from Purdue University, where he's been for 12 years. Is that what you said yesterday?
I think so.
And his office there is in a great shape, as he reminded me yesterday. I visited him there a couple of times. David has previously visited me in Melbourne several times. He's undergraduate from Harvey Mudd College, PhD from Stanford. We got to know each other at Berkeley in 2013, mainly because I was very impressed with the questions that David asked at seminars at the Simons Institute. And I thought, who's this guy? This is very insightful questions. And then we discovered we both like coffee. And then several papers later, here we are. So David is going to talk about, I did wonder about the word topological. He's going to talk about topological structures in complex predictions and graphs. Thank you, David.
Okay, thank you. So there's a fun little video, but the kids who are back in the audience there and are tuned out completely, which is probably good, but suggested that my talk might be boring. And so they wanted me to give some problems to the audience in case you were uninspired with what I was saying. And so they helped me come up with these. So the first one is add just a couple numbers in binary. So the first one is 39 ones and add that to 38 ones, and you get a fun pattern. We have some simple linear equations after that, and then they wanted something really hard. And so if you actually do this, you get a sort of clever pattern that comes out of it. And so seeing as there's people who do theory, you can say like, well, what happens if you try and generalize that pattern? And I imagine this has been solved somewhere in some obscure place, or maybe even not so obscure, but still a fun problem to think about. And I don't actually know the answer, so maybe it's, I think it's probably quadratic or something like that. Yeah, if anyone wants something to think about if they get bored with this talk, that would be it. Okay, so I'm going to do the thing I always tell my students not to do. And occasionally as a professor, you get to ignore your own advice, which is not to give 2 talks in one, but I'm going to give 2 talks in one. So the first one is about a paper where we actually sort of prove that a particular type of structure really is in graphs. So this was a structure that was conjectured a long time ago, or long in this case is about 15 or 20 years. And we actually came up with an algorithm to show that what people thought happened actually does happen. And the second thing is more on the AI, ML, deep learning side, which is how do we give people, or how do we show people actionable structure in their data? And this is in terms of, hey, I'm going to show this to someone who's going to use this algorithm. What might they actually want to see about what the algorithm is doing? And so that's what the first video was about. So that one's a lot of pictures. The first one is a little bit more theory, and if you like SDPs, you'll love the first one. SDPs are semi-definite programs in this case. Sorry, so the first bit starts with a very simple question. Do empirically collected networks, that is graphs that people see out there on the internet, graphs that Facebook sees, et cetera, have good cluster structure? That is, do they have good clusters? And like all good problems in computer science, there are 2 answers. So we have yes and no. So yes, you would say, yes, of course they have good cluster structure, right? I can take a big graph, I can take the web graph, or I can take the Facebook social network, or I can take the network of Tony's collaborators at the University of Melbourne intersect his collaborators at the University of Sydney or something like that. That's an empirical network. I can run some clustering algorithm, correlation clustering, Metis, Louvain, any type of algorithm that people have assessed to like take a graph and spit out clusters. There's thousands of these things. And you will see that there are dense regions, there are improved objectives, there are better than random partitions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, that's all great. So why would the answer potentially be no? Well, there's a sort of funny thing that happens when you do that. No one ever agrees on what the clusters are. You tend to get different answers depending on what algorithm you run. And the other thing is the clusters are never great. They're good, but they're never great. And so what do I mean by that? And what did, so about 20 years ago, I was working with a guy named Kevin Lang at Yahoo Research who had noticed this on a lot of Yahoo's data that they were seeing. And so he was, trained, he worked with Satish Rao and all sorts of other people that work on finding clusters in data. And they came up with a couple of mechanisms of sort of looking at this, which eventually turned into this paper on something called the network community profile that I'll explain in a second. But what they wanted to do was assess the sort of quality of clusters in data, but they wanted to do this in a size resolved scale. And so the way they do this is they take a graph, and so here I have a planar graph. So these ones have all sorts of nice structure. Essentially, if you have a big partition, there's a good way of cutting that off from the rest of the network just because space, essentially, well, I'll mention this in a second, but the way they do this in practice is they take a big graph and then you generate a very large number of clusters from many, 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 many different mechanisms. So take all the algorithms in the previous slide, run them all on this data set, and you have a big basket of clusters. It's okay if they overlap. You're just looking at sets in the data set here. In practice, what they found works better is just to take something like a seeded local PageRank method. This is where you essentially do a little random walk that tries to find bottlenecks in the graph. And you find, say, a constant number of clusters in the size of the graph. So think like 10% of the number of nodes. So here I grew tired of drawing lots of different clusters. So here's 3 clusters, and you can see, or sorry, 4. And so they can overlap. You're just trying to find lots of them. And then what they do is they plot these clusters in conductance versus size space. And so who's seen conductance before, graph conductance? Okay, graph conductance is fun. It's essentially a cut to volume ratio. And so if you like geometry, then essentially cut to volume is how much stuff is going out of the set versus how much volume is contained in. So some people call it an isoparametric constant of a graph. But if you think about it, like it's just the conductance of the set is I count the number of edges that a set is going to cut if I rip it out of the graph. And then the volume ends up being the sum of the degrees of the vertices. And there's 2 ways I like to think about this is the volume is the amount of data that you need to, or sorry, is proportional to the amount of information you need to store the adjacency information for those nodes. And so again, for this node here, it's got 5 neighbors, so I need to store 5 pieces of information. So I'd add 5 to my volume count. And so again, it's just the degree. So I sum up the degrees for all of the vertices. Another way to look at it is if your graph has any type of spatial component, volume is really proportional to like how much space it takes up. So if I go back here, the volume of this is essentially proportional to the, like in this case, it's a 2-dimensional thing, so it'd be area, but it's proportional to the area. And then cut is proportional to the perimeter. So if you like geometry, then you can think of it as perimeter divided by area, or surface area divided by volume, or whatever the higher dimensional analog to these are. For graphs, it's just edges divided by total number of incident vertices. We want small conductance. That means you're a good community or a good cluster. And there's all sorts of relationships to other things. So Markov chain mixing time, surface area to volume, as I've mentioned. And for a technical reason, we want the smaller of the 2 sides. Again, I said small conductance. So one way to make conductance very small would be to say like, oh, well, I'm going to have my set be everything except this one little node here. So there's that minimum up there to mean that essentially says you can't do that. We're going to look at the worst case between the two. Okay, so that's what conductance is. Now what we see is if we plot these things in log conductance versus log size, again, we're looking at these things over very big size scales. So think graphs with potentially billions of nodes and edges, or at least hundreds of thousands or millions. And so we get in this case, from these 4 groups here, you'd see this one. But if we did this for a very large number, you'd actually see this picture here. So as your size gets bigger, the size of the number of vertices, you see conductance go down. And so this is what you see if your graph has any type of geometric structure. Because as things get bigger, we can find better and better and better clusters that are bigger, because essentially surface area decreases at a slower rate than volume does. And so like again, the perimeter to area is a simple one. Area is quadratic, perimeter is linear. And so you've got a ratio of a linear to a quadratic, and that will go to 0 as size gets bigger. Okay, so this is things where we have a latent geometry. You might say, what do you see for a random graph? And for a random graph, it basically looks flat. You see no structure except for very, very, very small sets. So this is an Erdos-Renyi random graph. You do see a little bit of structure you can find for things under, say, 10 nodes or something, just because randomness sometimes goes right. Now, for empirically measured networks, things like the web graph, the internet, et cetera, what do you see? Well, you see something that goes down, like a latent geometry graph, and then goes back up. And so now, if you look at this, it still goes back up to a point that's a little bit lower than a random graph. So this is consistent with finding big things that are better than random, right? But not this better than random. It's just a teeny bit better than random, because again, this is on a log scale. And if you're looking for really good clusters, you can find them, but they're really small. And so this is what Kevin Lang was trying to understand and really investigate. And it turns out that, so this is one sample, but essentially you would see the same thing for a wide variety of graphs. So the same qualitative phenomena, that it goes down and then it comes back up. So here's a graph that's considerably larger. Again, you see the same shape. And so at some point they start getting worse again. And so sometimes you do see a little bit of decay up here because you do have that denominator term in there. But again, they all sort of look like this. And sometimes you have to squint a little bit, like the email network isn't quite as perfect. But essentially, they've looked at 50 to 80 networks and found this. Okay, and this holds for other clustering metrics too. So it shows up the best with conductance, but if you do it with modularity, you see something similar, but there are different quirks because modularity has its own quirks. If you do it with other types of notions, you get, again, basically the same thing, just differs a little bit. Something a little bit different holds for very, very, very dense empirical networks. And why this occurs is a matter of some debate. But what they had observed is that this does occur, but they never had a proof that this occurs. And so this was all empirical, right? They were just running a clustering algorithm over and over and over again and finding the shape. So can we be sure that empirical networks really have this behavior? And so apparently this was a real objection they got. So they tried to send this to Science or Nature or something like that. And the reviewers came back and said, maybe another algorithm, like maybe you guys just aren't smart enough, and another algorithm out there could be better. So how do you know? Well, this is where our paper comes in. So we actually give the first validation of this structure. And so now I don't want to say that the people on the previous paper weren't doing a good job. They did fabulous. Like they went above and beyond like any standard that we would have for a conference paper. This is like really, really good work. So no one really doubted that this was the case. On the other hand, there was no sort of like tied in a bow knot. Until the stuff I'm going to tell you about now. So what they did know is that there's a lower bound on conductance you get out of spectral clustering. So again, if you just find the smallest eigenvector, you can show that all of the clusters have to have conductance at least λ2/2. And so this is oftentimes called the Fiedler bound, all sorts of other things. So there's another one that comes out of semi-definite programs that's just a little bit tedious to state, and we'll see a better way of thinking about it in a second, which is a bound on the minimum bisection. So if you want to take your network and bisect it exactly into two pieces, you could show that the bisection couldn't be any better than that point there. Okay, and so you say, well, I know that there can't be anything below here, and there's nothing, and for bisection, it's got to be up there. But the question is really what happens in this region here? So can we be sure that these sets really go up? Is it possible that there's some super smart algorithm that could, you know, take this out to this one and only goes up at the very end? And the answer is no, as we're going to show in this talk. And the thing we actually end up using is this notion called mu conductance. So this is a really obscure concept that my co-author Cisa Chardry happened to know about, that came up in Lovash and Simonowitz's work on mixing of convex bodies in the 1990s. Essentially, this is just conductance, but subject to, you've got to be at least a mu fraction of the graph. So you've got to have at least 10%, so say mu is 0.1, then you've got to have at least 10% of the total volume of edges of the graph. Or if mu is 0.01, you've got to have at least 0.1% of the volume of the graph. And so what that means is essentially mu conductance is going to work like this spectral lower bound, but it's going to give you a point sort of somewhere over to the right. And so again, if mu is a half, you actually, it turns out that this reverts to this known bisection bound that you would have gotten there. So our key contribution in this first paper is a practical computation to lower bound the mu conductance, and this gives the first formal verification of this structure. All right, how do we do this? And there's a really interesting sort of intuition for what's going on with our technique to do mu conductance. So here is spectral clustering and the eigenvector that you see on top of your graph. Now I've drawn a graph that I can actually show in the plane, but what is hiding in here is a really dense cluster at the core. So you should think of this little point here as having a couple hundred vertices that are all really tightly connected, and then it sort of spans out from there. So when you compute this eigenvector, it localizes quite dramatically on that piece in the core. So you basically see it's high there and low everywhere else because you've got this really dense core that's sparsely connected. And that's exactly what gives you small conductance. Okay, that's great, but what I want to find is something that's bigger than this, right? I want to find something that's about half the graph or, you know, a tenth of the graph. And so the inspiration we had was, well, really what you want to do is you want to take this and just kind of like jelly, you want to squish it, right? You want to make sure that it's flatter somehow over the graph, because right now it's very peaky on this one piece. And so as you flatten it, so think of taking this and just like squishing it from above and below, you'll get something that's much more even across the graph. And so what we're going to do is we're going to basically solve a problem that tries to flatten out an eigenvector. All right, how do we do that? Well, here is the problem for the eigenvector over here. What we're going to do is we're basically just going to cap the maximum entry of the eigenvector, so the infinity norm. I'm a linear algebraist by training, so I have to use infinity norms. But it's really just the maximum absolute value. And then we're also going to say that things can't get too small. So we need this one for a slightly technical reason, but basically, read the paper if you want to know exactly why this one is here, but we can't let things get super small as well. And so that's it. So these just have a little fraction of mu in there. Essentially, this is the problem that we would like to solve. So these are the flattened eigenvectors that we saw on the previous paper, or on the previous slide here. Okay, so great, we're done. Just one little detail. I don't actually know how to solve this. So this is a non-linearly constrained eigenvector problem, which in principle, I guess, suffice it to say, I know no good techniques to solve this. I do, however, know how to relax that to a semi-definite program, which gets me a bound on the solution. So that's what we're going to do here. So we take this, and this is oftentimes called a lifting. It's a standard trick if you haven't seen it before, but it's a fun trick and useful. So you basically take this problem here, instead of looking at solutions over a vector X, you look at them over a matrix. And the inspiration is if your matrix X were equal to XX transpose, a rank 1 matrix, then they would be exactly the same problem. But we're not going to insist on having a rank 1 matrix XX transpose. We're going to relax it over the space of all rank n symmetric positive definite matrices instead. So we take it and we lift it up and we get an SDP here. Now, has anyone here worked with SDPs? Tony has a little bit. Tony, how well do SDPs solve or scale?
I never got them to really work for me. I mean,
Okay, well,
I tried once to sort of make it fit in a reasonable memory or time, and it was just
That's a accurate synopsis of SDP solvers and their scalability. So you could maybe solve this semi-definite program here for a graph of size 10,000, or sorry, 1,000. If you really wanted to push stuff, you could probably get to 10,000. There's no way you could get to 1 million. And this is in terms of number of vertices. The problem is SDPs don't scale, and this was recognized for a long time. And so what people do is they use this low rank heuristic, where they say, okay, this is impossible to solve, but the nice thing about this one is it's convex. So convex problems you can globally certify solutions for. So we know that this thing you can always get the right answer to. The problem is these things, so the idea here is you basically say, I want to take a rank K approximation of the solution, and that's great, but then you lose convexity and global optimality. And the reason we're doing this is to get lower bounds. And so we need global optimality to get this. And so a lot of times people just sort of like tuck this under the rug somewhere in the paper and kind of hope people don't notice and say like, you know, the solutions are pretty good out of this and they're mostly good. We wanted to try and do a little bit better than that. Although we can solve this one for reasonably sized graphs. I think like 1 million vertices. They're not fast, they take hours to solve, but we can do it. So again, just to make the same point in the slide, low rank SDPs cannot be globally solved, they are convex. So how do we get a lower bound? So we don't get a lower bound from this technique, or do we? And the answer is, this is sort of the key technical contribution in the paper. We can actually get a lower bound for a perturbed SDP. So we solve the low rank thing, and then we can essentially say how far away from solving the original problem we might be with this perturbed solution. And so it's like essentially the way this proof works is we say, okay, we know we're not solving this problem exactly. How far, but what we say is we're solving a different problem exactly, and then we're tying the two together. So we take the solution we get, we say, we know it's not exact, how far away, so we say there is another problem where it is exact, and how far away were the problem where we know it's exact is from the one we were trying to solve. And this allows us to get an a posteriori bound on it. So again, it's not an approximation algorithm because we can't say ahead of time how good this is going to be. But after the fact, we can say like, oh, you know what, this is actually really close to the solution. So that's what we do. And that allows us to get a lower bound on the entire thing. So essentially this term is going to be a lower bound on the exact thing. And the thing we have to solve here is just a minimum eigenvalue of a particular matrix in order to get the distance between the problems. That ends up being pretty fast, so that's not an expensive, hard computation at all. In terms of like solver time, so here are, SCS and Mosaic are two sort of are two SDP solver packages. And so for a graph with 85 nodes, you know, they run in seconds. For a graph with 500 nodes, they run in hours. If you do this technique with the low rank SDP, you go from seconds to seconds. You do lose a little bit in our final lower bound here, but overall you sort of get the kind of stuff you want. You can solve these things practically and get lower bounds that are useful. And lo and behold, that's what we show. So essentially here is that line that is the spectral lower bound, so that bottom line. And then as we vary mu, so we have to solve this thing a whole bunch of times as we vary mu, but we can trace out this curve that shows that it really does go up from the lower bound, from the spectral lower bound up to that bisection, and it's gradual. It doesn't, you know, it's not flat and then jumps up at the end. You might say, okay, you're doing this low rank approximation. How does the rank impact it? Well, yes, it makes a difference, but you get basically the same curve for a whole bunch of different ranks. And again, here we're just taking the tightest bound we get because they're all lower bounds on it. So essentially, the more work you do, the tighter your lower bound will be. You might say, why is there a big gap here? Well, these bounds are known not to be tight in the sense that even the spectral one can be off by a factor of 2 in practice. And so that's essentially it for the first one. So because I'm going to change topics a little bit, are there any questions about this one before I jump on?
I was
Yes.
about to say exactly, maybe we should take questions at this point.
Yes.
You're good.
Yeah, for this specific slide, so you show the trend with respect to the volume, but previously showed with respect to size, number of vertices. Like, is there any particular reason?
Great question. So we went back and forth on if we should do it. So classically, the NCP has always been done in terms of size, in terms of number of vertices. Just because the actual mu conductance bounds it in terms of volume, we chose to present it as volume here. You don't see anything different in terms of size. So if we had done it in terms of size, it just would change a little bit, but it wouldn't. The conclusion is the same, but great catch. Tony, I think you had a question too, or?
I'm just wondering if you go back to slide 24, how? Whoa. Meanwhile, I realize you're here at slide numbers, this is the thing I always tell students is always use slide numbers.
Yeah, we're on the same page there. I just hid them up in the corner.
I was like, what's he done with them? He's in the corner. It's like David wouldn't forget that. Anyway, how big can you actually? So you're kind of going 17 seconds, 21 seconds.
Oh, so how big can we go? In the paper, I think we push it to around 1 million vertices with like a couple hundred thousand vertices.
Okay.
In a more recent paper using similar techniques on slightly different problems, we can push it to like millions of vertices.
Wow. Okay.
So practically, you can now solve SDPs with, say, millions of vertices.
Okay.
The downside is you can't do them with lots of constraints. So the correlation clustering SDP I bet Tony is thinking of is notorious because it has a truckload of constraints along with it. And so these results wouldn't apply to that one.
That's okay. At least you can solve sort of realistic size. Because I mean, I look at these and I can imagine as somebody looking.
Like minimum bisection and max cut, you can solve up to, say, millions of vertices now fairly easily.
That's impressive.
I'm just wondering, does the new lower bound give you any new intuition as to why it goes up with volume?
Great question. The short answer is no. Essentially, the intuition or the reason that this goes up with volume is think of it like this. So it's easiest to think of in terms of social networks, but you have like groups of people that interact at different scales. So you folks have your social network here in Sydney, and then you would have your social network here in Australia. And so the Sydney group is a part of the Australia one, but the Australia one as a whole is going to look a lot more random than your little local group in Sydney does. And so if you just sort of keep repeating that intuition, as you get bigger and bigger and bigger, you just look more and more random. And so it doesn't mean you look completely random at all size scales, but you look, and indeed you look not like you can find non-random groups at any size scale, but it just means as you get bigger and bigger and bigger, you're just injecting more and more randomness as opposed to more and more signal. So that, but the new and like this just sort of proves that happens as opposed to gives you that intuition about what's going on there. But it might, I mean, if we could get stuff like Facebook or some of the data sets, you might be able to tease out a little bit more structure. So it'd be nice. I mean, it'd be a fun thing to explore, but getting the right data there would be challenging, unfortunately. All right. Any questions before I jump into topic 2? Okay, so topic 2 is very different, and I sort of give I oftentimes give this talk to mathematicians, and mathematicians get really upset when you talk about results before you've talked about like theorems and methods. But I'm gonna give this talk here where we're gonna show you some of the results we get from this method before I tell you what the method is, just because they're kind of interesting and tantalizing, and then they help you understand what the method is actually like. You'll understand the method better for having seen them ahead of time. So bear with me, this is a slightly different type of presentation. All right, so the starting for this one is all this like complex prediction people have been doing recently. So I'm imagining people have heard of deep learning and machine learning and all this stuff. And by and large, a lot of stuff like this is now a solved problem where we have 10 classes and we have great tools that can predict what is in the image. So here are 10 things that are all designed to be fairly different from each other. And here are all 10 pictures, like one picture from each class. And so the goal is to take an image and predict what is in it. And we're going to use a pre-trained ResNet 50 architecture. So it's got about 20 million numbers. And then it's got a last layer that's been retrained just to identify this set of 10 classes. So ResNet 50 was originally trained to identify 1,000 classes from ImageNet, of which these are 10. So we are just taking that and tuning it to find these 10 types of pictures. Okay, so I challenge you. What is in this picture? What should the prediction on this picture be? So this is my grad student's car filling up at a local gas station. So let's go through the options. Is this a fish? No. Is this a dog? No. Is this a cassette player? No. Is this a chainsaw? No. Church? No. French horn? No. Garbage truck? Oh, maybe that's not a bad prediction, right? Gas pump? Oh, hey, there's a gas pump. Golf ball? Well, there might be a golf ball in there, but I can't see it. And parachute? Probably no. So we would think that, I'm gonna hope people would have guessed gas pump. Seem reasonable? Okay, so by the end of the talk, you will understand that this is actually wrong and cassette player was the right thing to predict for this image. And so that is the type of actionable insight I claim people would want to know about their method. So here we have something that seemed all types of sensical, and yet it's predicting cassette player from this one. And if you showed this to a scientist, I think people would rightfully demand to know why, right?
No, I would want to say throw out the prediction.
Throw out the prediction, okay.
Throw out the predictor.
Throw out that, okay. Well, in this case, you're gonna understand why this comes up with cassette player by the end of this talk using this method. So stay tuned. All right, so just to give you a little bit of insight into what some of these black boxes are doing, essentially the way they work is they take in arbitrary data. This goes through an input layer, and then it runs through things that are designed to compute an encoding or an embedding of these input images. So these are things like convolutions or graph convolutions or transformers. Then at some point, they're going to take these embeddings and run them through something like a multi-layer perceptron, and then you get some type of output. And so we're actually going to use, just like peek inside them a little bit. Essentially, we are going to use the embedding matrix you get after these things. And so this is common in vision things, and it's common in vision architectures and in graph architectures. And then we're also going to use the class probability matrix as well. So from a deep neural network, we're going to assume you could extract these. And we're also going to make the assumption that you have a lot of unlabeled data to look at. So a common, like if you're a statistician, you might be horrified at this. But in science, it's common that you have lots of stuff you're trying to predict on. It's not like some abstract, opaque world in the future. You actually have a task and you want to label lots of things. And so we're going to assume you have access to all of those points, even if you don't, but you don't know labels on them. So you're trying to predict labels on all of these unlabeled things, but you know what you're trying to predict on. So we can get these both from the training data and all the things that you want to evaluate. Okay, so this is where we get into topology a little bit more directly. So topological methods were designed to sort of suss out structures and data. And so what we're interested in doing is sussing out the interaction between the predictions and the actual embedding data themselves. And so there was an algorithm in topology called Mapper that was designed to do some of these things. I'm going to explain what this is in a second, so you don't need to worry about it. But essentially, the inspiration for this algorithm was based on Mapper, and so we called this graph-based topological data analysis because we're going to use a graph as a key primitive of this. If you worked with Tony at all, or I do lots of graphs too, in addition to doing lots of linear algebra. Okay, so let me just give you a little bit more context for what the method actually puts out. So here is a similar type of data set. We're trying to predict a whole bunch of classes. Again, it's 10 classes here. This is called the fashion MNIST data set. It's designed to be a more challenging prediction task than identifying the written digits from MNIST. And so we have a set of fashion objects. And so the output of say another type of method, a ResNet 18 in this case, gives us a matrix with 70,000 images in 10 classes. So this is our prediction matrix, and this is our embedding matrix here. So again, these come out of the last convolutional layer in the perceptron. So we take these, we run it, that goes into our method, and out comes the following map of the data set. All right, so what is this map? Let me just explain it. So this is called a Reeb network, is what we call it, coming using some lingo from topology. They call these Reeb graphs if they're one-dimensional. Reeb spaces if they're multi-dimensional, but we're not doing a multi-dimensional thing, so we're sort of doing a graph, so we call them a Reeb network and just call it good. Each little bit in here is a set of, is a little graph. And each node is a cluster of samples. So it's a cluster of pictures. So it's not a picture, it's a cluster of pictures. And these pictures have the property that they're all close in the prediction and embedding space. So the idea is the mapper technique cuts and dices their data to find groups of related pictures and relationships amongst these groups of pictures. Now the node size is proportional to the number of samples, and then the little actual color is determined by the predicted label of everything in that group. So this means I've got some, I think it's about 10 pictures in this case, that all have the same label and all look alike. So those would be things that you probably would trust. Here you have something that has one prediction that's a little bit different. That might be something you want to investigate. But we'll see in places where you want to investigate things a little bit more clearly. This isn't, as you'll see in a second, this actually looks really good. So what are the connections between these nodes? Because they're clusters. Well, when I clustered this data set, I clustered it with overlap. And so essentially, nodes are connected whenever they share samples. So there's essentially something in common between these groups. So the other cool thing about these Reeb networks that come out is standard graph layout methods work. So if you've ever done any graph layout, you will know that you can draw a nice picture of a graph with, say, 100 nodes. There are artistic pictures of graphs with, say, 1 million nodes, but they aren't necessarily as useful to understand your data set. In this case, I hope I can convince you by the end of the talk that this is actually fairly useful. And again, a lot of that is just coming from the standard graph layout methods are doing a good job on these data sets. So let's zoom into this stuff. The nice thing about these is they sort of encourage you to explore your data. I've just given the labels here, but we get sort of a nice visual taxonomy out of these things. And so you can see different types of sandals being at different portions. So you go like flat sandals are here, these are sort of flat, and then you get a little bit more of a side to your sandal. You can get other types of sandals, something with a little bit more of a high heel, and these it's sort of automatically giving you these visual taxonomies. Now, one thing I'm going to tell you about is our method actually so we can utilize this graph structure here to predict places that might be worthwhile investigating further. And so we actually call this an error diffusion, but it's essentially just a random walk on where you see big differences between what you would predict based on your training data and what your method is predicting. So it's not to say that your method is wrong, it's just that there's some type of big gap in this graph space between what you should see. And so this allows us to sort of hone in on different pieces with this red here. And we can see things that, gosh, so we're calling this an ankle boot, we're calling this a sneaker, we're calling this an ankle boot, and we're calling this a sneaker. I guess if you're really a sneaker aficionado, you could recognize this as maybe something like a Converse sneaker. But then you see these ones, and again, maybe that's a Converse sneaker, but these all look very, very similar. And so the point is, if you're actually asking your method to distinguish these things, you're giving it a really hard problem to do, even to a human, right? And so if a human has a hard time with it, doesn't mean the algorithm can't solve it, but maybe you should think about giving your method some other information, like, and there's a better example in a second. So here is some clothing that, here's a t-shirt or a top, and here's a shirt. This is just essentially arbitrary as far as I can tell here. This is a pullover, that's a coat, that's a shirt, and that's a shirt. Now a coat, you might be able to decide if you knew the material, if it was if there was Gore-Tex in that one, fine, that's probably gonna be a coat or some other type of synthetic material. Whereas these ones I'm guessing are more cotton or wool or something like that. Similar thing here, I don't know how you would determine these two without additional information. And so again, the reason this is, I would say this is actionable is if you want to improve your ability to predict things here, you're going to need to give the method more information than just the picture. Like the picture is not going to help you distinguish these things. And even if you invest more resources in AI, you're essentially not going to really improve your prediction much. You're just going to overfit on some sort of little detail of these things. And so I wouldn't expect much generalization out of that. If we even came up with a method to make these things really visually attractive, but I'm not gonna have time to go into that here. Okay, so I've talked about GTDA in terms of images, but we actually designed it to work with graphs first, and then you'll see how we backed out how to get it to work for images second. So let me explain what it shows you on a graph prediction problem. Here we have a label inference problem. We've got essentially a graph with some nodes labeled, and the goal is to fill in the labels for all the missing nodes here. So again, there's a node here. You would probably predict it as essentially, you would hope that this is designed such that that is a orange node. Again, this is going to do well if there's something to be predicted, and it's going to do poorly if you're trying to be adversarial. So we're trying to predict the color class of all the missing nodes. How do we do this? There's this two-layer graph convolutional network. And we're actually going to add nearest neighbor edges just to make it a little bit more fun. And so it actually does a pretty good job. It's not perfect, but this scores test accuracy of about 0.88. So I don't know if you people consider that good or bad these days, but years ago that would have been considered pretty good. And so this is just correct predictions out of total predictions. So we're going to take our method and look at this, and essentially this is what our method takes that data and turns it into. And again, the nice thing I like about this is it sort of focuses in on regions where you might want to explore. So here are the regions you might want to explore, are all these sort of pieces sort of at the edges or the interfaces. And again, if you just sort of look at this, you can sort of zoom in and see different pieces. So here, you can take this piece and actually go back and look at it on the graph. And this is where, if there was a graduate student here, I think there is, if you were showing this to your advisor or something, and you showed them that, hey, I've got something like this, so I flipped and expand this to the data, and now I've circled all the training bits, the training and validation points. So I've got the training and validation points circled here, and those are predicted as purple. But yet all of the predictions around them are orange. So this is the kind of thing where you look at this and you go, what the heck is going on here? Why is it predicting all of these things as orange when those are purple? Like, based on everything else, we should say that these things are purple. Well, it turns out that the way that this was trained is we did a whole bunch of test validation splits. And so when we're looking at it with this tool, we're using all of the validation data and the training data. But the final training run, because of historical reasons about how people do this, which I think are probably wrong, they typically only use a fraction of the total data set that they've looked at to train it. So in this case, you're just going to get bad predictions that come out of it in ways that are actually detectable if you look at your data with everything that you've had been exposed to. And so this is essentially straightforwardly wrong at this point. It's also detectably wrong in that we could run that diffusion to get errors that basically correctly identify exactly where this thing is making mistakes. Okay, so I need to tell you what this method is, and I have about 8 minutes left in order to do that, which is just about the right amount of time. So GTDA comes from this algorithm called mapper. And so mapper was designed to sort of capture the shape of data independent of how you represent it. So here I have a trophy. I hope you can sort of visualize this as a three-dimensional trophy. And then I'm going to sample it as a whole bunch of point cloud data. So I've just taken a whole bunch of points here. So what mapper is designed to do is it's designed to sort of look at the data set under some type of what they call a lens or a filter function. And so here I'm going to look at it under the filter function where I just take this data set and project onto the z-axis. So what does a trophy look like if you project onto a z-axis? Well, the way it assesses that is it forms overlapping groups of points. So I'm going to take the z values between this region and get out a group of points. Z values between these overlapping regions and get out a group of points. So, okay, just to help illustrate this here, essentially I'm looking at this group of points, this group of points, this group of points here. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to cluster these ones. So once I have these individual groups here, I'm just going to run a clustering algorithm on all of them. Now, I've got a curve up here on the top one. Essentially, the algorithm I'm going to use for clustering this is I'm going to just use connected components. So connected components as long as points are nearby within some radius or something like that. So I'm not going to be very fancy. As long as you can reach 2 nodes, I'm just going to consider them in the same cluster. And because this is a circle, it's going to become one cluster. So every different group here will become one cluster. And then I'm going to connect clusters that share nodes. And so here, the one-dimensional projection of this trophy looks like the very boring line graph. And you say, why did you do all of that work? Well, because we can do other projections of the data. So here is the projection of the data, not on the z-axis, but on the y-axis in this case. And so if I do the same thing, all of a sudden I get some more interesting structure, right? I get 2 clusters out of this point because there's a very big spatial gap between those group of points here. And so when I form the Reeve network here, I get something that looks like an X in this case. And so again, this is how mapper is designed to show you what the data look like, again, independent of how you've chosen to represent it. So I'm doing projections to get filters on it, but again, we're sort of preserving the shape of the data. So you say, well, great, but you need one filter. And so essentially what we're doing is like all of these pictures here are just our way of running mapper on class prediction probabilities. And so there's a couple of things I have to explain on how we do this. So how do we do the clustering? How do we handle multiple dimensions? And how many parameters do we end up in this method? So just to explain this a little bit more, I'm going to call these different functions filters. So I'm going to explain it in the context of this graph problem here. So F1, F2, F3, those are the filter functions. Those come out of the multi-layer perceptron. In this case, I started with a graph. And so I don't need to do anything else, but there's a detail there that we'll see later. Oh, sorry, no, I did put it now. I couldn't remember if I did this. So when I did this before, the first thing we actually do is we actually get a KNN graph of these embeddings to put it in. And so we just treat everything like a graph. So that's what we had done there. All right, how do we actually run mapper on this? How do we handle multiple lenses at once? So the first thing we do is we take our graph and we look at our lens distribution and we pick the lens with the highest difference between values. We look for the biggest difference between largest and smallest. Well, initially we've normalized them all to be between 0 and 1, so there's no difference. We just pick one arbitrarily and we just pick the lowest index. So in this case, we pick lens 1 and we split the data in half based on lens 1 with a little bit of overlap between them. So we do the natural CS thing, which is recursion. So we split it into 2 halves, and then we cluster them just by connected components. Well, these are all connected, so I don't get any clusters there. And essentially here, I just keep doing the same thing. So again, I'm going to pick the highest lens, or the lens with the maximum difference. Now it's lens 2. Whereas this one became a little bit more interesting. There's actually a unique choice you would make. You'd always pick lens 3 there. And then you split them off into two groups, and all of a sudden now we start to see some really tiny groups emerge. And so we just keep repeating this on each component. If your group gets small enough, that is below 20 nodes, we just stop this process because it's a parameter, but we don't find it useful to proceed below 20 nodes, say. I mean, it might be 20, it might be 50, but there's some number that it's generally easy to pick. It's not 1,000 and it's not 5. And you just keep doing this over and over and over again. You just pick the lens, you move it off, you pick the lens and you move it over. And at the end, these are these different groups that we get. So again, you can see how this is designed to find regions that are all sort of similar with similar predictions. They are going to have places that differ. So again, there's going to be these things here. Okay, so this almost works. Here's the graph you get when you do this. And the couple of things we noticed is that there's lots of really teeny disconnected pieces, and those are not very useful. So we actually tried to merge things together. So essentially, if you're a small node, we look at something that's like a minimum spanning tree algorithm. We say, suppose we had increased overlap just a little bit. What node would you have connected to next? And so that's what we do. That's how we essentially merge these things in. So that gives us a much sort of beefier set of nodes to look at. So essentially, if you picked off a little bit that just got a little bit too small, we make it a little bit bigger. And then again, we sort of improve the connectivity a little bit. So if we see small disconnected pieces in this graph, we also try and connect them up a little bit more. And again, when we were looking at this, we wanted to understand prediction. And the idea with prediction is you generalize from the known to the unknown. And so we sort of want to make this a little bit more connected than it might seem just based on the predictions. And so that was how we were conceiving of doing this. And so essentially, that's how you go from that data set to this graph here. You just follow this sequence of division steps, and then you improve the connectivity a little bit more. Okay, so again, how do we highlight these curious regions? I'm running out of time here. I'm almost done though. So to do this, we just run a few steps of a random walk from all of the known values. And we essentially say, like, what would that have predicted? If that's very different from what was predicted, we highlight it. So it's a page ranked random walk. So if you know me, you wouldn't be surprised about that. But it's very similar to other types of diffusions. So again, clustering, we're doing connected components, multiple dimensions. We're doing this recursive splitting and proceeding. How do we do all these different things? So the maximum cluster size, usually about 5% of the smallest class works. Overlap about 1%. The different size thresholds, 5 seems to be a useful benchmark to start with there. And if you see something weird, you can usually easily address it. How long does this take? It's usually much faster than training. Okay, so I haven't told you why this car shows up first. So let's end on that note. So if you try some other types of inspection methods that are designed to highlight what it sees as the most important regions, it says that these are the most important regions in predicting that this is a cassette player. Well, I don't see anything that looks obviously like a cassette player there. So if we use our graph and we sort of study the visual taxonomy of gas pumps, this is something I bet everyone was expecting in this talk. You see people who take pictures of the handle. You see people who take pictures of their total. You see people who take pictures of old school gas pumps. And then you get down to this really interesting region where you see different styles of gas pumps. And then all of a sudden you start to see cars here. And so again, if you look back at this one, you see this really mixed node. And these are things that would really concern me if I'm looking at a method or assessing a method. These are the predicted labels are in red and the true labels are in blue here. So here in our training data was a picture of a cassette player. Here's a garbage truck, or sorry, here's a cassette player. Here's a cassette player, here's a cassette player, here's a cassette player, here's a cassette player, here's a gas pump, here's a cassette player, here's a chainsaw. There really is a chainsaw there. So why does this method predict that that car was a cassette player? It's because we asked it to.
Some idiot mislabeled.
Well, it's probably even worse than this. So how was this data set constructed? It was constructed from people doing Google searches for these phrases and then curating all of the images. So there's a distinctive pattern with all of these pictures of cassette players here. Does anyone see what it is?
Cars with cassette players in them, like old enough.
These are used car sales, and they were advertising the cassette player as a feature of the car. So essentially your data set was polluted. And again, now you say that and like, oh, of course you would like, once you see this, of course, obviously this is the case. But it's hard. I mean, we've got like hundreds of thousands of images here. How do you find this stuff? And so this just like nails in on that. And so we tried to screw with this to make sure, like to see if we could reliably find it, and we can. And with that, I'm basically out of time. We have similar stories for other types of data sets in Amazon, where basically people are trying to say things like, is an internal hard drive a data storage or a computer component device? And the answer is yes. And in fact, like what you should do in like, if you take one thing out of this, it's that you should really be doing hierarchical prediction sort of a lot, which is that don't try and divide it into classes, like do a hierarchy. And Fei Li had some nice stuff about this about a decade ago too, which apparently we're still not really using enough of. We also had some nice stories on assessing some of the structures in proteins. I just don't have time to talk about it. In terms of actual times, people always like to see this for CS people. So here is how long it takes to do a study I didn't talk about, but a bigger one. So it takes about 13,000 seconds to do all the prediction and embedding work we need. And then the GTDA stuff actually runs in about 10 minutes for an overall time of about, then GTDA takes about another 5 hours on top of this. But this one here takes 36 hours to train. And so it's not like, again, these are not unreasonable times when you put them in the context of training. I had some concluding remarks, but I'm out of time. So that's it. Thank you. I'm happy to take questions on this. But
Why do you pitch this as analyzing complex prediction methods rather than finding bugs in your training data, which is what I'm hearing that you're saying? You've got a method which is great for taking training data and finding bugs in it. It's got nothing to do with how that training data is then used for predictions. What you're actually doing is finding bugs in the training data.
That's a great question. I mean, we talked about different ways of pitching this and like analyzing the predictions. I mean, it's not like it. We do have a few stories where it's more than just bugs in your training data. It's just that those are the easiest ones to sort of rock. Like again, more generally, I view this as trying to use your human intuition to understand what your algorithm is doing. So for instance, when we were originally looking at this on images, we found that what ImageNet is basically doing to classify parachutes is it's looking for a lot of green in your picture. If it sees a lot of green in your picture, it'll call it a picture of a parachute. And so again, we could use that to create sort of surrogates that it would mislabel. Lots of different, but you're right. Like I think if I could tell people to do nothing else, I would say like, please run this on your data set just to make sure you're not totally out to lunch. So for instance, there's a chest x-ray data set that people had released, which was supposedly curated by radiologists, yada, yada, yada. Well, it turns out that like 20% of the ground truth labels that people were analyzing were somehow wrong. And so our method couldn't find all 20%, but of the stuff it flagged as suspicious, about half of it actually was incorrect. So again, that's a pretty easy, I mean, if you find that half of this like big group of things is suspicious, maybe do a little bit more work on your data set.
So how do we get our medical image processing people to listen to this?